Hey, do you like zombies? What about birds? Well, boy oh boy do I have the sculpting video for you today, because we're making one of those horrible rotting zombie birds from the game Elden Ring. A friend of mine got me into that game over the last couple of months, and I'll never forget the first time I saw one of those awful beasties, and then pretty much immediately died. But hey, this one is mostly harmless, and it'll make a nice addition to the other creepy critters scattered around my apartment. The bird starts off as a few twisted strands of wire, bulked up with aluminum foil. I have a fun idea to have the bird perched on a rock with only one leg holding up the whole thing, so I twizzled together some of my thickest armature wire to make the supporting leg as strong as possible, adding some baking soda and super glue to the wobbly bits to make them less wobbly. I'm also using cosplay for the whole sculpture so that the bird will hopefully bend and flex instead of breaking. Oh, and feathers. I'm gonna be using lots of feathers. Now I know that in my last video I said I'd never use feathers again because they were such a horrible nightmare to work with, and ended up coating my finger skin in a crispy layer of feather crust that took an absurd amount of time and pain to remove. But I have an idea, and spoiler alert, it actually almost made feathers fun. Once the sculpture is completely covered in clay and roughly blended with my fingers, I'll shape the beak and start mouthing up the mouth. And hey, it's a surprise visitor coming to say hello to the camera. Once the inside of the mouth is all finished, I'll bake off some nice sharp teeth. And then remember that birds have tongues. This will be held in a nice yelly pose with the help of some scrap aluminum foil. And with that, we'll dip the ends of our teeth in some liquid clay one by one, and stab them into the beak. Then all this progress can get snapped onto the other side, and we'll add a couple more to make them look extra monstrous. I've had a lot of fun sculpting beaks in the past. Weirdly, I think I might have made more beaks than human faces. This beak gets some good and gnarly battle scratches and scars, smoothed out with some isopropyl alcohol. With the beak done, we can press in a deep recess into the skull, into which we can fit some beady little eyes. These get some eyelids, and then we can start texturing the skin haphazardly with a ball stylus to add a base layer of scarred and wrinkly skin. And then with a tryptophobia roller, we'll add on the dimply bird flesh. I'm not going too detailed with the texturizing, mostly because I know that the vast majority of this will all be covered with a thick layer of feathers later on, but also because I felt like some simple bird skin would just do the trick. In Elden Ring, the giant crows in Caelid have been infected with Scarlet Rot, which causes festering sores and pustules all over their mangy bodies, which only adds to their monstrous appearance. I'm decaying the bird in two main ways, first with all these little pockmark holes around the body, and then next with some large buboes and pustules. I'll start adding the little mounds of blisters in choice locations, with the main pile being on the neck hump. These each get their own little holes to look like the buddings of a Scarlet Aeonia. With the pustules finished, I can bake the bird for the first time, and get started on the base. Clay doesn't usually like to stick to wood, so to encourage a connection, I'll scratch up a disc of wood, then dollop some liquid clay on top so that we can add some strips of clay that I would describe as thematically meat-colored. And if this sculpture doesn't make you hungry, that's probably a good thing. Gentle administration of a rock helps the base get a nice earthen texture, onto which we'll add a slightly larger lump of clay that will be our rocky perch. Now, to make sure that the bird fits securely, I'll press the armature wire in now so that the clay rock is ready for mounting later on. Then we can start adding some of the flora of Caelid, starting with these nasty little cup plants. These are just discs of clay rounded out with a ball stylus and pressed into these little clusters. Also, I'm not really sure why I made the base using red clay, since I'll have to repaint this all white later on. But that's an issue for future me to regret when I'm in desperate need of red clay. With the base baked, I'll fit the bird in place, and fill the perch holes with some 5-minute epoxy. This will keep everything extra sturdy and make sure that the supporting leg has even less chance of breaking. Some quick bones get wound around the suspended leg to make the talons. And then we can add some noodles of clay to make up each foot, texturing with a few different sculpting tools. Then we can poke in some big sharp claws into the end of each toe tip. After a quick bake, I'll spread some glue on the base and sprinkle on some rocks and gritty sand to add some additional texture. Then we'll knock off the excess and get on to painting. Using the airbrush, I'll paint the bird a slightly darker gray and then douse the red clay base in a white primer to prep it for subsequent layers later on. My jar of black wash always needs a little shake to unseparate the colors, and then we can douse the whole bird in a thick layer to really enhance the texture. Once that's dry, I'll come back in with a bloody red to paint the insides of each open sore, standing out as horrible little pockmarks against the dull gray skin. Next, I'll dry brush the whole bird with a pinkish gray to bring out the texture and lighten the raised edges. The main attraction on the skin, however, is the big and bulbous pustules, which start off with a layer of pink to set the base tones, followed by some reds and terracottas to add some variety to each boil. Once these are looking delightfully nasty, I'll come in with a purple wash to add some bruised colors to the recesses and tie the buboes together. Next, I'll whip out the airbrush again to set a light coat of brown over the beak and feet. Then spray into the depths of the mouth to get a uniform coat of maroon. The eyes and toenails get painted pitch black, and then I'll come over the whole bird one last time with another coat of black wash to tie everything together and darken some of my overzealous dry brushing. Oops, and I missed some blisters on the armpit here, so let's get that fixed. Last but not least for the painting, I'll give each tooth a coat of bone white. Then some nasty yellow grime to really emphasize that this bird does not own a single toothbrush. Then we can dollop some gloss varnish onto the pustules, eyes, and mouth. And add some Fabri-Tac slobber strands between the jaws. And then we're on to the base. We'll start off the land of Caelid with an orangey wash, followed by some mottled browns and greens to blend everything together into the landscape. While that dries, I'll paint the insides of each little plant cup with a fleshy reddish pink, not worrying too much about overpainting on the edges. And then we can come in with some light dry brushing to emphasize the texture on the rocks and sand. The bigger rocks get doused in a gray wash, followed by some black to sink into the crevices, and some additional dry brushing to make it look like an average rock. Then we can clean up the white edges on all the little bowl plants one by one. And now it's time to spread out some glue and test a new static grass applicator. I didn't give myself enough space above the terrain to make this work really properly, so I'll need to test again in the future, but not too bad overall. To liven up the landscape, I'll glue in some little roots and twigs poking out from the rocks, then speckle in a few green bushes to add some color and life into the dusty earth. Now I know you might be thinking, doesn't this bird feel a little bit bare? Well, now it's the dreaded feather time. For this bird we're using two main types of feathers, these fluffy wispy ones for the feather floof, and these more sturdy and shapely feathers for the wings and tail. For each of the larger sturdy feathers, I'll snip the tip, and distress the edges and crinkle the feather between my fingers to make it look ragged and unpreened. Then, starting with the legs, I'll stick each feather into a tiny pre-drilled hole. The main goal here is to make the bird look as mangy and patchy as possible. So if it looks gross and imperfect, like a half-plucked chicken that you just fished out of a drainage pipe, then you're on the right path. I'll split each of the feathery feathers in half and then dice those halves into chunks that I can glue onto the bird's back. This was a really long process, but it was honestly just really relaxing to put on some YouTube in the background, turn my brain off, and just stick feathers onto the monster bird. The trick with the glue that I found is to avoid the super glue as much as possible and stick more to tacky glue. Since it's thicker and doesn't dry as fast, it's easier to keep exactly where you want it on the feather tips and not have it run all over your fingers. Secondly, even if it does get all over your fingers, it's tacky glue. You can just wipe it off, or wash your hands. If you get super glued feather fluff to your fingers, then you become Mr. Krusty Bird Fingers, and no one wants that. This process creates an insane amount of airborne feather fluff, so every once in a while it was important to vacuum my zombie bird to keep the area as featherless as possible, and limit the amount of black dyed feather debris that I kept breathing into my lungs. The white glue will dry clear, so I'm not too worried about the little excess dollops. Just layering the wing feathers properly so that they look not quite aerodynamic enough to fly, but maybe enough to flap and hop around a little. The key, just like with all other feather types, is in the layering, adding more where it feels sparse and filling in any gaps with fluff so that the skin doesn't seem too bare. Once the wings are finished, we'll give our bird a quick ASMR haircut to tone down the floofiness and get our feather shapes more in line with the original design. Then we'll vacuum up our haircut mess, give our zombird a blowout, and finish the base off with a crisp lining of black. Thank you all so much for watching. This was a really fun video to make, and it was great to be back into making some toothy monsters. As always, I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and a special shout out to my newest patron, Arcane Jill. Thank you so much for supporting the channel and helping me in my ever-evolving quest to find new ways to make freaky floofy beasties. I hope you liked the video. More sculptures are on the way. I'll see you then.